The acrid smell of industrial disinfectant burned my nostrils as I pushed the heavy cart down the pristine hallway of St. Catherine's Children's Hospital. Each wheel squeaked in a rhythm that matched my exhausted heartbeat. Squeak, roll, squeak, roll. A sound that had become the soundtrack to my 16 years of invisible existence in these sterile corridors. My mother's rubber gloves were too large for my hands, causing them to slip as I gripped the handles of cleaning supplies that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that particular shade of sickly blue-white that made even healthy skin look pale, and I caught my reflection in the polished floors, a skinny black girl drowning in a janitor's uniform that hung loose on my frame. Dark circles under my eyes from another sleepless night spent reading medical textbooks by the light of my phone. Faith, the executive wing needs attention before the board meeting, Mrs. Rodriguez called from behind the nurse's station, her voice carrying that practiced tone of authority mixed with barely concealed pity. Dr. Walsh specifically requested our best workup there. I nodded, keeping my eyes down as I'd learned to do around the medical staff. In the 3 years since Mom started bringing me to work during school breaks, I'd perfected the art of invisibility. But my mind was always absorbing, always analyzing the conversations that floated past me as if I were just another piece of hospital equipment. The executive wing occupied the entire 15th floor, where the children of politicians, celebrities, and what Mom whispered were dangerous men received treatment. As the elevator climbed, I pressed my hand against the weight of the stolen medical journal hidden beneath my uniform, today's reading material, borrowed from Dr. Martinez's office while I cleaned around his sleeping form during the night shift. The elevator dinged softly as the doors opened to reveal a scene of controlled chaos. Nurses rushed between rooms with the kind of urgent efficiency that spoke of a critical case. I caught fragments of hushed conversations. 4 weeks without improvement. Every specialist in the city. The family is getting desperate. I began my routine, starting with the consultation rooms that lined the corridor. The familiar motions of wiping down surfaces and organizing supplies allowed my mind to wander to the case presentation I'd overheard earlier. A 7-year-old boy presenting with progressive muscle weakness, cognitive decline, and seizures that didn't respond to standard treatments. 23 different specialists had examined him over the past month, each one adding their expert opinion to a growing tower of medical records that seemed to lead nowhere. As I cleaned the conference room windows, I could see into the family consultation room across the hall. A man sat with his back to me, his broad shoulders filling out an expensive charcoal suit. Even in silhouette, he radiated the kind of quiet authority that made nurses speak in whispers and doctors check their ties before entering. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and when he turned his head slightly, I caught a glimpse of sharp features and eyes the color of winter storms. This had to be the father, Frank Castellano, a name that was whispered in the same breath as words like family, business, and never crosses. The nurses spoke of him with a mixture of fear and fascination, the way people discuss sharks, beautiful, powerful, and absolutely lethal if provoked. A small movement in the room caught my attention. A woman with platinum blonde hair sat beside him, her manicured hands twisted together in her lap. But it was the child between them that made my breath catch in my throat. Even from this distance, I could see the telltale signs I'd been reading about in my borrowed journals. The slight drooping of his left eyelid, the way his head tilted to compensate for muscle weakness, the subtle tremor in his small hands. Faith. The sharp voice behind me made me jump, sending my spray bottle clattering to the floor. Dr. Walsh stood in the doorway, his steel-gray hair perfectly combed despite the early hour, his expression cold with disapproval. I thought I made it clear that the cleaning staff should avoid the family areas during consultations. "I'm sorry, Dr. Walsh," I mumbled, scrambling to collect my supplies. I was just finishing the windows. His pale eyes narrowed as they took in my appearance, and I could practically hear him cataloging everything that marked me as an outsider in his pristine medical kingdom. The too large uniform, the worn sneakers with duct tape around the toe, the cheap ponytail holder barely containing my natural hair. "The Castellano family values their privacy," he continued, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper doctors used when they wanted to intimidate without witnesses. "I trust you understand the importance of discretion in cases of this. Sensitivity." Before I could respond, the consultation room door opened. Frank Castellano emerged, and the hallway seemed to shrink around his presence. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall and lean with the kind of controlled grace that spoke of violence held carefully in check. His storm-gray eyes swept the corridor, taking in every detail with predatory precision before settling on Dr. Walsh. "Doctor," his voice was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor tiles. "I assume you have news about my son's condition." Dr. Walsh's demeanor changed instantly, morphing from condescending authority to obsequious deference. "Mr. Castellano, I'm afraid the test results are still inconclusive. We're consulting with additional specialists, bringing in experts from Johns Hopkins and—" "4 weeks," Castellano interrupted, his tone never rising but somehow becoming more dangerous. 23 doctors, hundreds of thousands of dollars in tests, and my son is getting worse. The blonde woman appeared in the doorway, her designer dress wrinkled from hours of vigil. "Frank," she said softly, her voice carrying a slight Italian accent. "Perhaps we should consider other options. There are specialists in Switzerland. Or—" "Isabella," he said, and she fell silent immediately. His attention returned to Dr. Walsh. "I've been patient, doctor. My patience has limits. I should have left, should have finished my cleaning and disappeared back into the invisible machinery of the hospital. But something in the way the child's mother gripped the doorframe, something in the barely controlled desperation beneath Frank Castellano's cold exterior, made me pause. And then I saw him, little Finley Castellano, barely 7 years old, struggling to walk down the corridor toward us. His left leg dragged slightly, and I could see the effort it took for him to maintain his balance. But it was the specific pattern of his symptoms that made my heart race with recognition. The drooping eyelid combined with the muscle weakness, the way he favored his right side, the slight slur in his speech that the nurses had mentioned. I'd seen these exact symptoms described in a case study just last week, buried in a journal about rare genetic disorders that most doctors never encountered. "Mitochondrial encephalomyopathy," I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. The conversation stopped. 3 pairs of adult eyes turned to stare at me. Dr. Walsh with horror, Isabella with confusion, and Frank Castellano with something that might have been curiosity. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" Dr. Walsh's voice was deadly quiet. My mouth felt dry as cotton, but I couldn't take the words back now. The symptoms, the ptosis, the progressive muscle weakness, the cognitive changes. It's presenting like mitochondrial encephalomyopathy with lactic acidosis and stroke-like episodes. Mealis syndrome. Dr. Walsh's face flushed red. "How dare you? Wait!" Frank Castellano's voice cut through the doctor's outrage like a blade. His storm-gray eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to disappear into the floor. "You're suggesting a diagnosis that 23 specialists missed?" I wanted to shrink away, to mumble an apology and escape to the safety of anonymity. But Finley was looking at me now, his young eyes bright with intelligence despite his condition, and I thought about all the medical texts I'd devoured in secret, all the knowledge I'd accumulated that everyone assumed a janitor's daughter couldn't possibly possess. "The muscle biopsy would show ragged red fibers," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "And the lactate levels in his blood would be elevated. If you did a genetic test for the M3243AG mutation—" "That's enough!" Dr. Walsh stepped forward, his face contorted with rage. "Security! I want this girl removed immediately!" But Frank Castellano raised a hand, and Dr. Walsh froze mid-sentence. The power dynamic in the hallway shifted palpably, and I realized that whatever authority Dr. Walsh wielded in this hospital, it was nothing compared to the force of nature standing before us. "No," Castellano said simply. "I want to hear what she has to say." And in that moment, standing in the sterile hallway of St. Catherine's Hospital with my cleaning cart beside me, and the most dangerous man in the city waiting for my words, I realized there was no going back. Whatever happened next would change everything, for better or worse. The weight of their stares pressed down on me as I took a shaky breath and prepared to either save a child's life or destroy my own. I need to continue the story from Faith's perspective, maintaining the first-person narrative throughout. The story should follow the structure outlined in the instructions, building tension through mundane moments that become extraordinary, and developing the relationship between Faith and Frank Castellano while she proves her medical brilliance. Let me continue with part 2, focusing on demonstrations of power and control, showing Frank's network of influence, Faith discovering she's been watched, and introducing secondary threats. The silence that followed my words stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, drowning out the soft hum of medical equipment and the distant chatter of nurses who had no idea that everything was about to change. Frank Castellano studied me with those winter storm eyes, and I felt like a specimen under a microscope. His gaze moved from my face to my uniform, to the cleaning cart beside me, then back to my eyes with an intensity that made my skin crawl and burn simultaneously. Melas syndrome, he repeated slowly, testing the words. And you know this how exactly? Dr. Walsh sputtered beside him. Mr. Castellano, please don't encourage this ridiculous display. The girl is a janitor's daughter with delusions of... I asked her, not you. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dr. Walsh's mouth snapped shut so quickly I heard his teeth click together. I gripped the handle of my spray bottle tighter, using the familiar weight to ground myself. I read medical journals, I said quietly. The New England Journal of Medicine published a case series on Melas just 3 months ago. The patient presentation was almost identical to your son's symptoms. You read medical journals. It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. Faith. Isabella Castellano spoke for the first time, her accented voice soft, but carrying an edge of desperate hope. That's a beautiful name. How old are you, sweetheart? 16, ma'am. 16. Frank's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. And where exactly does a 16-year-old janitor's daughter get access to medical journals? The question hung in the air like a sword over my head. I could lie, make up some story about the library or online access. But something about the way he asked it, the careful precision of his words, told me he already knew the answer. I take them from doctors' offices when I clean, I admitted. I borrow them overnight and return them before anyone notices. Doctor, Walsh made a strangled sound. She's been stealing... Borrowing, Frank corrected, his voice calm but final. The journals were returned, I assume. I nodded quickly, always. Usually before the doctors even wake up from their naps during night shifts. A ghost of a smile played at the corner of Frank's mouth. Industrious. He turned to Dr. Walsh. I want the tests she mentioned. All of them. Today. Mr. Castellano. Dr. Walsh's voice was strained. I cannot authorize expensive genetic testing based on the amateur diagnosis of a cleaning girl. The hospital board that includes 3 men who owe me very large favors? Frank's tone remained conversational, but the threat underneath was unmistakable. Or perhaps you'd prefer I mention to them how you've been billing for consultations while sleeping in your office during night shifts. Dr. Walsh's face went white. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that Frank Castellano knew about things that happened in the shadows of this hospital, things that people thought were invisible, just like me. Of course, Dr. Walsh stammered. I'll order the tests immediately. Good. Frank's attention returned to me. Miss Morrison. Faith Morrison. Miss Morrison. The way he said my name made it sound important, weighty. I'd like you to be present when the results come in. My knees nearly buckled. Sir, I'm not qualified to... You're the only person in this hospital who's given me a plausible explanation for my son's condition in 4 weeks. His eyes hardened. That makes you more qualified than anyone else here. Dr. Walsh looked like he was about to have a stroke. Mr. Castellano, hospital protocol strictly forbids. Then change the protocol. Frank's voice carried the kind of authority that moved mountains and toppled governments. Miss Morrison is now a consultant on my son's case. I'm sure you can arrange the proper paperwork. As Dr. Walsh hurried away, muttering under his breath about insurance liability and medical boards, Frank turned back to me. Up close, I could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the way his expensive suit couldn't quite hide the tension in his shoulders. This was a man who controlled everything, who bent the world to his will, except he couldn't heal his sick child. Isabella, he said without taking his eyes off me. Take Finley back to his room. Make sure he's comfortable. Frank, she hesitated, glancing between us. "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure." His tone brooked no argument. Isabella gathered their son, who had been watching our exchange with bright, curious eyes, and disappeared down the corridor. When we were alone, Frank stepped closer. I could smell his cologne now, something expensive and subtle that probably cost more than my mom made in a month. The hallway suddenly felt smaller, more intimate, despite its clinical sterility. "Faith Morrison," he said thoughtfully. 16 years old. Honor student at Marcus Garvey High School despite missing significant class time to work here with your mother. No father listed on school records. Lives in a one-bedroom apartment on the south side with Maria Morrison, night shift cleaning supervisor at St. Catherine's for 8 years. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. "How do you—" "I know everything about everyone who enters my son's orbit," he said simply. "Did you think I wouldn't have you investigated the moment you opened your mouth?" The casual way he mentioned having me investigated sent panic clawing up my throat. "We don't want any trouble, Mr. Castellano. My mom and I, we just keep our heads down and do our work." "I know." His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Your mother is an exemplary employee, never missed a shift, never caused problems. And you." He paused, studying me again. "You have the highest GPA in your class, despite working here 30 hours a week. Perfect attendance in your advanced placement courses. Teachers describe you as brilliant but quiet. College applications submitted to pre-med programs with full scholarship potential." I stared at him, speechless. He knew more about my life than most of my classmates did. "The question is," he continued, "why is someone with your obvious intelligence cleaning floors instead of studying in a laboratory somewhere?" "Because laboratories don't pay minimum wage to support my mom," I said, anger finally overriding fear. "Because brilliant but quiet black girls from the South Side don't get invited into laboratories. Because my mom works 3 jobs to keep us afloat, and I work here to help." Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, which I would have hated, but something that looked almost like respect. "Dr. Martinez," he said suddenly. I blinked. "What?" "The journals you borrow. You take them primarily from Dr. Martinez's office. Emergency pediatrics. Night shift supervisor." He tilted his head slightly. "He's been leaving them where you can find them, hasn't he?" My heart stopped. Dr. Martinez was a kind man in his 50s who'd always been polite to me and Mom, but I'd never thought. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Frank's smile was knowing. "Dr. Martinez has been watching you for months. He's noticed your interest in medical cases, your questions about procedures. He's been deliberately leaving journals on specific topics, seeing if you'd pick up on patterns." The memory hit me like a physical blow. Dr. Martinez last week, asking me casual questions about a patient case while I cleaned around him. I'd answered without thinking, pointing out inconsistencies in treatment that had been bothering me. He'd listened with unusual attention, before nodding and going back to his paperwork. "He recommended you," Frank continued. "Not directly, of course. But when I asked about exceptional individuals in this hospital, staff members who might notice things others missed, your name came up." "You asked about me before today?" My voice came out as a whisper. "My son has been dying for 4 weeks, Miss Morrison. I've asked about everyone." His jaw tightened. "Janitors often see more than doctors. They're invisible, present in every room, privy to conversations that happen around them as if they don't exist." He was right, and we both knew it. I'd overheard diagnoses, treatment plans, family secrets, insurance fraud discussions, all because people like Dr. Walsh treated cleaning staff like furniture. "But you," Frank's voice dropped lower, more intimate. "You don't just see, you understand. You analyze. You remember details that trained physicians dismiss." A commotion down the hallway interrupted us. Dr. Walsh had returned with 2 other doctors I recognized, Dr. Harrison, the chief of pediatric neurology, and Dr. Kim, head of genetic medicine. They approached like a medical tribunal, their white coats billowing behind them. "Mr. Castellano," Dr. Harrison began, his tone carefully diplomatic. "Dr. Walsh has informed us of the situation. While we appreciate your urgency regarding your son's case, We must insist that proper medical protocols will include Miss Morrison's input, Frank finished smoothly. Unless you're suggesting that 4 weeks of your expertise has been more productive than 10 minutes of hers? Dr. Kim cleared his throat uncomfortably. Sir, with all due respect, the young lady has no medical training, no credentials. She has the correct diagnosis, Frank said flatly, which is more than I can say for any of you. The doctors exchanged glances, clearly struggling between their professional pride and their awareness of exactly who they were dealing with. Finally, Dr. Harrison spoke. We'll run the tests, the muscle biopsy, genetic screening, metabolic workup, but it will take several days for results. Then we wait, Frank said. He turned to me, his storm gray eyes unreadable. Miss Morrison, I'd like you to review my son's complete medical file. All of it. I want your opinion on every test, every diagnosis, every treatment decision. My mouth fell open. Patient files were confidential, protected by federal law. I can't. I don't have clearance. You do now. Frank pulled out his phone and made a brief call. I caught fragments. Temporary consultant status, full access, effective immediately. When he hung up, he looked at me with something that might have been amusement. The hospital administration is very accommodating when properly motivated. Dr. Walsh looked like he'd swallowed something sour. I'll have the files prepared. As the doctors dispersed, Frank stepped closer to me again. This time, I didn't step back. One more thing, Miss Morrison. His voice was quiet, meant for my ears alone. My son's condition has attracted attention. There are people who would see advantage in his continued illness. People who might view anyone helping him as an obstacle to be removed. A chill ran down my spine. Are you saying someone might try to hurt me? I'm saying that as of today, you're under my protection. His words were simple, matter of fact. No one will harm you or your mother while you're helping my family. The promise should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a golden chain settling around my neck. Beautiful, valuable, and completely inescapable. As Frank Castellano walked away, his expensive shoes silent on the polished floor, I realized that my life as I knew it was over. Whether I saved his son or not, there would be no going back to invisibility, no returning to the safety of anonymity. I was in his world now, and his world had rules I was only beginning to understand. The medical records room had been transformed overnight into what looked like a war room. 3 tables had been pushed together to accommodate the mountain of files, test results, and diagnostic images that comprised Finley Castellano's medical history. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I spread the documents in chronological order, my hands trembling slightly as I touched papers that represented 4 weeks of desperate searching for answers. Dr. Martinez sat across from me, his kind eyes bright with curiosity. He'd been assigned as my medical supervisor for this consultation. Frank Castellano's way of ensuring hospital protocols were technically followed, while giving me unprecedented access to confidential patient information. Take your time, Dr. Martinez said gently. Read everything. Don't let anyone rush you. I nodded, opening the first file. Finley's admission photo showed a bright-eyed boy with his father's sharp features and his mother's gentle smile. The contrast with what I'd seen in the hallway, the muscle weakness, the cognitive slowing, the exhaustion, made my chest tight with urgency. The initial presenting symptoms were textbook: sudden onset of vomiting, severe headache, and confusion following what his parents thought was a simple stomach flu. By the time they'd brought him to the emergency room, he was having seizures. The attending physician's notes showed the immediate concern about encephalitis or meningitis, but lumbar puncture and brain imaging had ruled out both. As I read through the progression of tests and consultations, a pattern began to emerge that made my stomach clench with dread. Each specialist had focused on their own narrow field of expertise, missing the bigger picture that was screaming from the pages in front of me. The neurologist had seen the seizures and muscle weakness, ordering EEGs and brain MRIs that showed stroke-like lesions in unexpected patterns. When standard stroke treatments failed, he'd passed the case to metabolic specialists. The metabolic team had noted the elevated lactate levels in Finley's blood, but attributed them to his seizures, rather than considering them as a primary diagnostic clue. They'd run standard metabolic panels, all of which came back normal, then referred him to genetic specialists for rare disease workup. The geneticists had ordered a broad panel for common childhood disorders, but hadn't specifically tested for mitochondrial diseases because, as one note stated, patient doesn't fit typical presentation. But he did fit the typical presentation, if you knew what to look for. Dr. Martinez, I said slowly, can you explain why no one tested his muscle enzyme levels? Dr. Martinez leaned forward, scanning the files. What do you mean? Look at this. I pointed to a series of lab results. His creatine kinase levels are mentioned here in passing. They're elevated, but no one followed up on that finding. Elevated CK can indicate muscle damage, Dr. Martinez mused, but in the context of his other symptoms. It's another piece of the MELAS puzzle. I pulled out a printed research article I'd tucked into my jacket. Look at this case series from Boston Children's. 7 patients with MELAS syndrome. Every single one had elevated CK levels at presentation. Dr. Martinez studied the article, his expression growing more serious. Faith, if you're right about this diagnosis. Then, 23 doctors missed something that should have been caught in the first week, I finished. The door opened, and Frank Castellano entered with his characteristic silent grace. Today he wore a navy suit that made his gray eyes look like storm clouds, and I noticed he moved with the economy of someone who was always aware of his surroundings. Behind him came Isabella, looking pale but determined. How are we progressing? Frank asked, settling into a chair beside me. His proximity made me hyper-aware of everything, the subtle scent of his cologne, the way his expensive watch caught the fluorescent light, the controlled power in his voice. The pattern is consistent with mitochondrial disease, I said, spreading out the timeline I'd created. But there's something else, something that bothers me. Frank's eyes sharpened. Explain. I hesitated, knowing that what I was about to say would sound like paranoid rambling, but the numbers didn't lie, and I'd learned to trust patterns even when I couldn't explain them. The treatment decisions, I said carefully. Some of them don't make sense. What do you mean? Isabella leaned forward, her accent more pronounced when she was worried. I pulled out 3 specific consultation reports. Dr. Walsh recommended high-dose steroids when Finley first presented with inflammation markers. But steroids can actually worsen mitochondrial function in MELAS patients. It's contraindicated. Perhaps he didn't know about the contraindication, Dr. Martinez suggested, but his voice sounded uncertain. Then there's this. I pointed to another report. Dr. Harrison suggested a specific anti-seizure medication that's known to be hepatotoxic in children with metabolic disorders. And here, I flipped to a third document. Dr. Kim recommended postponing the muscle biopsy for 2 weeks to wait and see if symptoms improve naturally. Frank was very still, that predatory stillness that reminded me he was far more dangerous than his expensive suit suggested. You're saying the doctors made treatment decisions that harmed my son? I'm saying that every major treatment decision has either delayed correct diagnosis or potentially worsened his condition. My voice was steadier than I felt. Individually, each choice could be explained as clinical judgment, but taken together. Taken together, it looks deliberate, Frank finished, his voice deadly quiet. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Dr. Martinez cleared his throat nervously. We should be careful about making accusations without proof. I have proof. The words came out before I could stop them. All 3 adults turned to stare at me. I have evidence. Pattern evidence. Frank's eyes never left my face. Show me. With shaking hands, I pulled out a folder I'd compiled during my lunch break. I'd spent the past 3 days in the hospital's computer system, using my mother's access codes to pull data I had no business accessing. I cross-referenced Finley's case with other patients who've been treated by the same team of specialists over the past year. I began. There are patterns. The first chart I spread out showed treatment timelines for 12 patients. Each of these children came from wealthy families. Each had complex medical conditions that required extended hospitalizations, and each had treatment delays that resulted in longer hospital stays and higher medical bills. Frank studied the chart with the focus of a man accustomed to analyzing profit and loss statements. You're suggesting systemic medical fraud. I'm suggesting that someone has a financial interest in keeping certain patients sick longer than necessary. I pulled out another document. Look at the billing records I could access. The average length of stay for comparable cases in other hospitals is 2 weeks. Here, it's 6 weeks. Isabella gasped softly. They're making money from our children's suffering? It's more than that, I continued, my confidence growing as the evidence spoke for itself. I think Dr. Walsh is specifically targeting families with certain characteristics. I didn't say what we all knew, that Frank Castellano's money came from sources that wouldn't welcome scrutiny. Medical bills from a children's hospital were perfect vehicles for money laundering, and keeping patients sick longer created more opportunities for inflated charges. Frank stood slowly, and I could see the careful control he maintained over what must be volcanic rage. Dr. Martinez, I need to speak with Miss Morrison privately. Dr. Martinez hesitated. Mr. Castellano, hospital protocol requires... We'll be satisfied by you waiting in the hallway. Frank's tone made it clear this wasn't a request. When we were alone, Frank turned to face me. The fury in his expression was carefully banked but unmistakable. How certain are you about these accusations? 90%, I said honestly. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. And the other 10%? Could be explained by incompetence rather than malice. I met his eyes steadily. But incompetence doesn't usually generate such precisely profitable outcomes. Frank was quiet for a long moment, his storm gray eyes calculating. When he spoke, his voice was conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying. Dr. Walsh has made a very serious mistake. What are you going to do? First, I'm going to get my son the correct treatment. Frank moved to the window, looking out at the city below. The muscle biopsy results should be available this afternoon. The genetic testing will take longer, but I suspect you're right about the diagnosis. And then? He turned back to me, and for a moment, I saw past the expensive suit and controlled demeanor to something primitive and protective underneath. Then Dr. Walsh and I are going to have a conversation about medical ethics. A chill ran down my spine. I was beginning to understand that when Frank Castellano had conversations with people, those people often discovered that their lives had fundamentally changed. Mr. Castellano, I said carefully, I know you're angry, but if you do something dramatic to Dr. Walsh, it might affect Finley's care. The other doctors might become afraid to treat him properly. Frank studied me with those penetrating eyes. You're concerned about my methods. I'm concerned about Finley, I said honestly, and about making sure he gets better without anyone else getting hurt. Something shifted in Frank's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or a kind of grudging respect. You're worried about Dr. Walsh's welfare. I'm worried about consequences, I corrected. There are ways to handle this that don't involve whatever you normally do to people who cross you. Frank moved closer, close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes. What would you suggest, Miss Morrison? The fact that he was asking for my opinion, treating my concerns as valid, sent an unexpected warmth through my chest. Evidence, legal evidence. If Dr. Walsh is committing medical fraud, there are agencies that investigate that. Federal agencies that can destroy his career and send him to prison without any connection to you. That would take months, years perhaps. But it would be permanent, I countered, and it would protect other children from being victimized. Frank was quiet for a long moment, studying me with that unsettling intensity. Finally, he nodded slowly. You think like a chess player, Miss Morrison. Several moves ahead. I think like someone who doesn't want to see more children get hurt. Even children whose families can afford the best medical care money can buy. Especially those children, I said firmly. Because if someone is targeting them, it means the system is corrupted at the highest levels. Frank's smile was small but genuine. Dr. Martinez was right about you. What did he tell you? That you see patterns others miss. That you care more about being right than being liked. That you have the instincts of a natural diagnostician. Frank paused. He also said you were brilliant enough to revolutionize medicine if someone gave you the opportunity. My heart hammered against my ribs. Dr. Martinez said that? Among other things. Frank's expression grew serious. Miss Morrison, I'd like to make you an offer. Before I could ask what kind of offer, Dr. Martinez returned with a nurse carrying a tablet. Mr. Castellano? The biopsy results are ready. The nurse handed the tablet to Frank, who stared at the screen for a moment before passing it to me. My hand shook as I scrolled through the pathology report, but the findings were exactly what I'd expected to see. Ragged red fibers, I read aloud. Increased mitochondrial proliferation. Cytochrome C oxidase negative fibers. I looked up at Frank and Isabella. It's MELAS syndrome. The diagnosis is confirmed. Isabella burst into tears, not of sadness, but of relief. After 4 weeks of uncertainty, they finally had an answer. Frank's expression didn't change, but I saw him take a deep breath, the first time I'd seen him show any sign of the stress he'd been carrying. What does this mean for treatment? Isabella asked through her tears. Targeted therapy, I said, already mentally reviewing everything I'd read about MELAS management. Mitochondrial cocktail supplementation, careful monitoring of metabolic stress, avoiding medications that worsen mitochondrial function. And his prognosis? Frank's voice was carefully controlled. With proper treatment, many MELAS patients live normal lifespans, I said honestly. Some have learning disabilities or muscle weakness, but Finley's young. His brain is still developing. If we start treatment immediately, there's every reason to hope for excellent outcomes. For the first time since I'd met him, Frank Castellano smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face and made him look younger, more human. Miss Morrison, he said quietly, you've given me back my son's future. The weight of gratitude in his voice made my chest tight with emotion. But before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from my mom. Dr. Walsh wants to see you in his office. Now. Says it's urgent. Frank noticed my expression change. What is it? I showed him the message. His face went cold again, that dangerous stillness returning. Dr. Walsh wants to see me, I said unnecessarily. Does he? Frank's voice was soft and deadly. How convenient. I believe I'll accompany you to that meeting. As we left the medical records room, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change again. We'd found the answer to Finley's illness, but in doing so, we'd uncovered something much darker. And Dr. Walsh knew we knew. The elevator ride to his office felt like descending into a trap, but with Frank Castellano beside me, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry, and for the first time in my life, I had someone with the power to do something about the injustice I'd uncovered. The game was about to change, and Dr. Walsh was about to discover what happened when you threatened something Frank Castellano protected. Dr. Walsh's office occupied a corner of the hospital's administrative wing, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city. The space was designed to intimidate. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, walls lined with medical degrees and awards that proclaimed his importance to anyone who entered. But as Frank Castellano and I stepped through the doorway, I realized that all of Dr. Walsh's carefully constructed authority meant nothing in the presence of real power. Dr. Walsh sat behind his massive desk, his pale eyes narrowed with barely contained fury. He'd removed his white coat, revealing an expensive suit that probably cost more than my mom made in 3 months. Flanking him were 2 men I didn't recognize, one in hospital security uniform, the other in a dark suit that screamed corporate attorney. Miss Morrison. Dr. Walsh's voice was ice-cold courtesy. Thank you for coming. I believe we have some serious matters to discuss. Frank moved with that predatory grace, settling into one of the leather chairs as if he owned the place. I remained standing, my hands clasped behind my back to hide their trembling. Mr. Castellano, Dr. Walsh continued, while I appreciate your investment in your son's care, this meeting concerns Miss Morrison's recent activities. Activities that have violated patient privacy laws, hospital protocols, and potentially federal regulations. Has she? Frank's voice was conversational, almost amused. How interesting. The attorney leaned forward. Miss Morrison, I'm David Hartley, representing the hospital's legal interests. We have evidence that you've accessed confidential patient records without authorization, made unauthorized copies of medical documents, and shared protected health information with unauthorized individuals. My stomach dropped to my shoes. They had me. Whatever justification I might offer, the facts were undeniable. I had accessed records I had no legal right to see. Furthermore, Dr. Walsh added, you've made serious accusations against respected medical professionals based on incomplete information and adolescent speculation. Such accusations could constitute defamation and malicious interference with medical practice. Frank was so still he might have been carved from stone. And what exactly are you proposing to do about these alleged violations? Dr. Walsh's smile was sharp as a scalpel. Miss Morrison will sign a statement acknowledging her mistakes, apologizing for any unfounded accusations, and agreeing never to discuss the details of any cases she may have observed while working here. In exchange, we won't pursue criminal charges for her violations of federal privacy laws. And if she refuses? Frank asked quietly. Then we'll have no choice but to involve law enforcement, Hartley said smoothly. Computer fraud, violation of HIPAA regulations, theft of proprietary information. Miss Morrison could face significant jail time and financial penalties that would bankrupt her family. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. I thought of my mom, working 3 jobs to keep us afloat, trusting me to be responsible and stay out of trouble. The idea of my actions destroying her life made me physically sick. Of course, Dr. Walsh continued, there's also the matter of your employment here, both yours and your mother's. I'm afraid this incident has raised serious questions about the trustworthiness of your family. You're threatening to fire my mother? The words came out sharper than I intended. Dr. Walsh spread his hands in a gesture of false regret. Hospital policy is very clear about family members of employees who violate patient confidentiality. Your mother's continued employment would create an ongoing security risk. I felt the walls closing in around me. Sign their statement. Admit I was wrong. Watch Dr. Walsh continue his profitable scheme of keeping sick children hospitalized longer than necessary. Or refuse. And watch my mother lose her job while I faced federal charges that could send me to prison. Frank hadn't moved during this entire exchange, but I could feel something dangerous building in his stillness. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and deadly. Dr. Walsh, I'm curious about something. Of course, Mr. Castellano. The treatment protocols you recommended for my son, were they based on current best practices for his condition? Dr. Walsh's confident expression flickered slightly. I recommended treatments based on my extensive experience and training. I see. Frank pulled out his phone and scrolled through something. So when you prescribed high-dose steroids for a child showing signs of mitochondrial dysfunction, that was based on your extensive experience? Dr. Walsh's face was beginning to flush. The diagnosis was unclear at the time. Was it? Frank continued scrolling. Because according to the medical literature, the symptoms were quite specific. And according to this email thread, he turned his phone so we could all see the screen. You were specifically warned by Dr. Martinez that steroid treatment could be contraindicated. Dr. Walsh went pale. How did you get access to internal hospital communications? Frank's smile was razor sharp. The same way I discovered your billing irregularities. The same way I learned about your financial arrangements with certain pharmaceutical companies. The same way I found out about your gambling debts and the rather creative methods you've been using to pay them off. The room went dead silent. Hartley was staring at Dr. Walsh with growing alarm, clearly realizing that his client had more problems than unauthorized access to medical records. I don't know what you think you've discovered, Dr. Walsh began, but his voice was shaking now. I've discovered that you've been deliberately prolonging treatment for wealthy patients to inflate medical bills, Frank said calmly. I've discovered that you've been prescribing unnecessary procedures and medications that have kickback arrangements with companies you have financial ties to. And I've discovered that my son nearly died because you were more interested in profit than proper medical care. Frank stood slowly, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Miss Morrison identified all of this through pattern analysis and careful observation. She's 16 years old with no formal medical training, and she outperformed 23 credentialed specialists. Do you know why? Dr. Walsh seemed incapable of speech. Because she actually gives a damn about healing sick children instead of exploiting them. The security guard shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure whether he was supposed to be protecting Dr. Walsh from Frank or Frank from Dr. Walsh. Hartley was frantically typing on his phone, probably trying to determine if his law firm wanted any part of whatever was about to happen. Frank turned to me, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. Miss Morrison, would you like to know what I learned about Dr. Walsh's financial situation? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Dr. Walsh owes approximately $2 million to some very unforgiving people. People who charge what you might call aggressive interest rates. He's been using his position here to generate additional income streams, insurance fraud, pharmaceutical kickbacks, billing manipulation. All to pay debts to people who collect payment in, rather, creative ways. Doctor. Walsh sank into his chair, his face gray with terror. You can't prove any of that. I can prove all of it. Frank's voice was matter-of-fact. Federal agents are very interested in Medicare fraud. The FBI loves cases involving systematic insurance scams, and the IRS becomes quite enthusiastic about unreported income from pharmaceutical companies. Hartley was already standing, gathering his papers. Dr. Walsh, I strongly recommend you retain separate counsel. This firm can no longer represent you in this matter. You can't leave, Dr. Walsh protested, but Hartley was already heading for the door. Watch me, the attorney called over his shoulder before disappearing into the hallway. The security guard looked between Frank and Dr. Walsh, clearly trying to decide which man posed the greater threat. Frank solved his dilemma by addressing him directly. Officer Henderson. Frank read the name tag. I'd suggest you return to your normal duties. This is no longer a security matter. Henderson didn't need to be told twice. He practically ran from the office, leaving just the three of us. Dr. Walsh stared at Frank with undisguised terror. What do you want? I want you to sign a different statement, Frank said pleasantly. One acknowledging that Miss Morrison's analysis was correct, that her actions were justified by your medical malpractice, and that she deserves commendation rather than punishment. I can't. You can, and you will. Frank's voice didn't change, but somehow became more menacing. Because the alternative is that I share my evidence with federal investigators, medical licensing boards, and the families of every child you've harmed with your greed. Dr. Walsh's hands were shaking as he reached for a pen. If I sign this, what happens to me? You resign quietly, claim health issues, and disappear from medicine forever. Frank's tone was almost conversational. You move somewhere far away and find a new career, something that doesn't involve other people's lives. And if I refuse? Frank's smile was cold as winter moonlight. Then you discover why people in this city are very careful never to cross the Castellano family. The threat was delivered so quietly, so matter-of-factly, that it took a moment for the full implications to sink in. Dr. Adpai, Walsh understood immediately. His face went from gray to white, and I thought he might actually faint. There's paper in your printer, Frank observed helpfully. I'd suggest you start typing. As Dr. Walsh began composing his statement with shaking fingers, Frank turned to me. Miss Morrison, I believe this concludes our business here. Would you care to check on my son's treatment plan? I nodded, still stunned by how quickly the entire situation had reversed. 20 minutes ago, I'd been facing criminal charges and financial ruin. Now Dr. Walsh was typing his own resignation letter, while Frank Castellano stood guard like an avenging angel in an expensive suit. One more thing, Frank said as we reached the door. Dr. Walsh looked up from his typing with desperate hope. Miss Morrison's mother. I believe she deserves a promotion. Something in hospital administration, perhaps, with a substantial salary increase and full benefits. Dr. Walsh nodded frantically. Of course. Whatever you think is appropriate. I think Director of Quality Assurance would be appropriate, with oversight responsibilities for medical protocols and patient advocacy. Frank's smile was sharp. Mrs. Morrison has always been observant about hospital operations. I suspect she'll be excellent at identifying areas for improvement. As we left Dr. Walsh's office, I finally found my voice. You just destroyed him. I gave him a choice, Frank corrected. He can disappear quietly and rebuild his life somewhere else, or he can face federal prosecution and the families of children he harmed for profit. I consider that generous. What about the other doctors, the ones who went along with his protocols? Ignorance and incompetence aren't criminal, Frank said as we walked toward the elevator. They'll receive additional training and closer supervision. Dr. Martinez will be taking over as department head. He's been lobbying for changes to patient care protocols for months. The elevator arrived, and we stepped inside. As the doors closed, Frank turned to face me. "Miss Morrison, I owe you a debt that can never be fully repaid. You saved my son's life." "I just noticed patterns," I said quietly. "Anyone could have seen them if they'd looked." "But they didn't look. You did." Frank's gray eyes were intense. "You cared enough to risk everything for a child who wasn't yours, for a family you barely knew." The elevator reached the main floor, but Frank made no move to exit. Instead, he pressed the button for the 15th floor, Finley's floor. "I mentioned earlier that I wanted to make you an offer," he said as we ascended. "What kind of offer?" "Full scholarship to Johns Hopkins University, pre-med program with guaranteed admission to their medical school. All expenses paid, plus a living stipend for you and your mother." Frank's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he was discussing the weather rather than changing my entire life. "In exchange, you spend your summer breaks working with my family's foundation, helping to identify and correct systemic problems in pediatric care." My legs nearly gave out. Johns Hopkins was one of the most prestigious medical schools in the country, completely beyond my financial reach. "Mr. Castellano, I can't accept." "You can, and you will." His tone brooked no argument. "Consider it an investment in the future of medicine. Someone with your diagnostic abilities shouldn't be cleaning floors because her family can't afford medical school." The elevator doors opened on Finley's floor, revealing Isabella waiting in the hallway. Her face was radiant with relief and joy as she saw us approach. "The doctor started the new treatment," she called out. "Finley is already responding. His muscle strength is improving, and the seizures have stopped completely." Frank's expression transformed, the cold authority melting away to reveal something warm and human underneath. Miss Morrison's diagnosis saved him. Isabella rushed forward and embraced me before I could react, her designer perfume and genuine gratitude overwhelming my senses. "Thank you," she whispered against my ear. "You gave us our son back." As she pulled away, I saw tears in her eyes, tears of relief and hope that made my own eyes burn with emotion. "There's something else," Frank said quietly. "Miss Morrison, how would you feel about having a permanent research position with our foundation, starting immediately while you complete your undergraduate work?" My voice failed me completely. "We need someone to oversee medical quality assurance for all the children's hospitals our foundation supports," Isabella added. "Someone who can identify problems and implement solutions. Someone who cares more about healing children than medical politics." I thought of Dr. Walsh, typing his resignation letter with shaking hands. I thought of all the children who might be suffering because doctors were more interested in profit than healing. I thought of the patterns I could identify, the problems I could solve, the lives that might be saved. "Yes," I said simply. "Yes to all of it." Frank's smile was genuine, transforming his entire face. "Welcome to the family business, Miss Morrison. The legitimate side of it, of course." As we walked down the corridor toward Finley's room, I realized that my life had just changed in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. But for the first time since my mom had started bringing me to work at the hospital, I felt like I belonged somewhere. I had found my calling, and apparently, my calling had found me a very powerful protector. 3 months later, I stood in the boardroom of St. Catherine's Children's Hospital, facing a panel of medical administrators, federal investigators, and journalists who had come to hear the findings of what the media was calling the most comprehensive investigation of pediatric medical fraud in recent history. The mahogany table gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the walls were lined with charts and graphs that told a story of systematic corruption spanning years. Frank Castellano sat in the back of the room, his presence subtle but unmistakable. He wore his authority like a well-tailored suit, quietly, confidently, with the absolute certainty that he belonged wherever he chose to be. Beside him sat Isabella, her designer dress understated but elegant, her attention focused entirely on the presentation materials spread before us. Dr. Martinez had been appointed interim chief of staff, and he stood at the head of the table with the easy confidence of someone who had finally been given the authority to implement changes he'd been advocating for years. His kind eyes found mine across the room, offering the same gentle encouragement that had sustained me through the intense weeks of investigation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Martinez began, "we're here today to discuss the findings of our investigation into treatment protocols and billing practices within our pediatric specialty departments. This investigation was initiated based on pattern analysis conducted by Miss Faith Morrison, a 16-year-old research consultant whose observations uncovered systematic irregularities." Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Unit stepped forward, her crisp suit and no-nonsense demeanor commanding immediate attention. The investigation revealed a complex scheme involving deliberately prolonged treatments, unnecessary procedures, and inflated billing for pediatric patients from high-net-worth families. Dr. Walsh and his associates generated approximately $2 million in fraudulent charges over 3 years. A murmur ran through the room. The journalists scribbled notes frantically while camera crews adjusted their equipment to capture every detail. "Miss Morrison," Agent Chen continued, "would you please explain how you identified these patterns?" I stood slowly, my legs steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Over the past 3 months, I'd grown accustomed to being taken seriously by adults who initially dismissed me as just a cleaning girl. The transformation had been gradual, but unmistakable. Confidence built on vindicated observations and successful diagnoses. The patterns became apparent when I cross-referenced treatment timelines with billing records. I began, my voice carrying clearly across the room. Patients from wealthy families consistently had longer hospital stays and more expensive treatment regimens than patients with identical medical conditions from middle-class families. I moved to the presentation screen, clicking through charts I'd prepared. For example, pediatric appendectomies for uninsured patients averaged 3 days of hospitalization with total costs of approximately $8,000. The same procedure for patients with premium insurance or private pay averaged 8 days with total costs exceeding $22,000. The medical justification for these extended stays? Asked Dr. Helen Reeves from the Medical Licensing Board. There wasn't any. I clicked to the next slide. Post-operative complications occurred at the same rate, regardless of socioeconomic status, but wealthy patients were consistently held for observation and subjected to additional testing that had no medical necessity. Agent Chen nodded approvingly. Miss Morrison's analysis led us to examine billing records for the entire department. We discovered that Dr. Walsh had established relationships with several pharmaceutical companies and medical device manufacturers that provided him with financial incentives for using specific products and procedures. Frank shifted slightly in his chair, his storm gray eyes focused on the federal agent with predatory intensity. I'd learned that he viewed FBI investigations the way a chess master viewed opponents' moves, analyzing strategies, anticipating outcomes, calculating potential threats to his interests. The Castellano case was particularly egregious, Agent Chen continued. Young Finley presented with clear symptoms of Milas syndrome, but Dr. Walsh deliberately delayed proper diagnosis to extend the hospitalization period. His treatment choices were not only medically inappropriate, but actively harmful to the patient. Isabella's hand tightened on Frank's arm, and I saw him cover her fingers with his own in a gesture of comfort and protection. Finley had made a complete recovery, but the memory of those weeks when he'd been getting worse instead of better still haunted his parents. Miss Morrison, Dr. Reeves addressed me directly. You mentioned that other medical professionals were involved in this scheme. Can you elaborate? I hesitated, glancing toward Frank for guidance. He nodded almost imperceptibly, giving me permission to share information that could implicate people he might have business relationships with. 3 other physicians were aware of Dr. Walsh's practices, I said carefully. Dr. Harrison in neurology, Dr. Kim in genetics, and Dr. Phillips in pediatric surgery. They didn't initiate fraudulent billing, but they failed to question obvious irregularities and sometimes participated in unnecessary procedures. And their current status? Asked Martha Webb from the hospital board. Dr. Harrison and Dr. Kim have entered plea agreements and are cooperating with the investigation, Agent Chen replied. They've agreed to supervised practice arrangements and will participate in additional ethics training. Dr. Phillips resigned and relocated to private practice in another state. What about Dr. Walsh himself? The question came from Rebecca Stone, an investigative journalist who had been following the story from the beginning. Agent Chen's expression grew grim. Dr. Walsh disappeared approximately 6 weeks ago. His last known location was a charter flight to the Cayman Islands. Federal marshals are actively searching for him, but he appears to have significant financial resources and may have been planning his escape for some time. Frank's expression didn't change, but I caught a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes. I suspected he knew exactly where Dr. Walsh had gone and what had motivated his sudden departure, but that information would never appear in any official report. "Miss Morrison," Rebecca Stone addressed me directly. "You're 16 years old with no formal medical training. How did you develop the expertise to identify problems that experienced physicians missed?" The question I'd been dreading. I glanced toward my mother, who sat in the front row wearing the professional attire of her new position as Director of Quality Assurance. Her proud smile gave me the courage to tell the truth. "I taught myself," I said simply. "I've been reading medical journals and textbooks since I was 12. When I started working at the hospital, I had access to real cases that helped me understand how textbook knowledge applied to actual patients." "And your future plans?" Dr. Martinez asked with paternal pride. "I've been accepted to Johns Hopkins University for next fall," I said, unable to suppress my own smile. "Pre-med with a focus on pediatric diagnostics. I'll also continue working with the Castellano Foundation to identify and prevent medical fraud in children's hospitals nationwide." Frank stood as the formal presentation concluded, his movement drawing every eye in the room. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "St. Catherine's Hospital will be implementing new protocols based on Miss Morrison's recommendations," he said. "Every pediatric case will undergo independent review by the Quality Assurance Department. Billing practices will be audited monthly by external firms, and any physician who shows pattern irregularities will face immediate investigation." "Mr. Castellano," Rebecca Stone said, "your foundation is funding these new protocols. What's your long-term vision for pediatric care reform?" Frank's smile was sharp but genuine. "My vision, Miss Stone, is simple. No child should receive substandard medical care because their parents can't afford the best treatment, and no child should receive harmful medical care because their parents can afford to be exploited." As the crowd began to disperse, Frank approached me with Isabella at his side. Finley walked between them, his small hand clasped in his father's much larger one. The boy's recovery had been remarkable. His muscle strength had returned to normal, the seizures had stopped completely, and his cognitive function showed no lasting impairment. "Miss Faith," Finley called out, using the nickname he'd given me. "Papa says you're going to be a real doctor." "That's right," I said, kneeling to his level. "And I'm going to help make sure other children get better faster than you did." Finley nodded solemnly. "Because doctors should help people, not hurt them." The simple wisdom in his words hit me like a physical blow. This beautiful, intelligent child had nearly died because a physician chose profit over healing. How many other children had suffered? How many families had been devastated by medical greed disguised as expertise? Frank seemed to read my thoughts. "The Foundation has identified 17 other hospitals with similar irregularities," he said quietly. "We'll need your help developing protocols to address them." "Of course." I stood, meeting his storm-gray eyes. "Mr. Castellano, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Why me? You could have hired teams of medical consultants, forensic accountants, anyone. Why trust a 16-year-old with something this important?" Frank was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving from my face to his son, then back. "Because you saw my child as a person who needed healing, not a revenue source to be exploited. Because you risked everything to do what was right, even when no one would have blamed you for staying silent." Isabella stepped forward, her accent soft but determined. "And because you have the most important qualification for this work, you actually care about the children." As we walked toward the hospital exit, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. 3 months ago, I'd been an invisible teenager pushing a cleaning cart through corridors where my presence barely registered. Now I was heading to one of the nation's most prestigious universities, funded by a foundation that bore my name alongside the Castellanos, with a mission to protect children from the very system that was supposed to heal them. "Miss Morrison," Frank said as we reached the parking garage, "there's one more thing." I turned to face him, curious about his serious tone. "Finley has been asking if you'd consider being his honorary big sister, officially." Frank's expression was carefully neutral, but I caught the hint of uncertainty in his voice. Isabella and I would be honored if you'd join our family in a formal capacity. The invitation took my breath away. Family. Not just professional association or financial patronage, but actual belonging with people who valued my mind and trusted my judgment. Yes, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I'd be honored. Isabella's smile was radiant as she embraced me, and Finley cheered with the pure joy that only children could express. Frank's smile was smaller, but no less genuine, and when he extended his hand, I shook it with the solemnity of someone sealing a life-changing agreement. As the Castellano family's car pulled away from the hospital, I stood in the garage for a moment, looking up at the building where everything had started. St. Catherine's Children's Hospital would never be the same. Neither would I. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Martinez. Board meeting next week to discuss your recommendations for the new ethics and pediatric care curriculum. Think you're ready to teach medical students? I smiled as I typed back, ready to change everything, because that's exactly what we were going to do. 2 years later, I stood before the assembled faculty and students of Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, delivering what the Baltimore Sun would later call the most influential presentation on medical ethics in a generation. The lecture hall was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjacent rooms. Medical professionals had traveled from around the world to hear about the protocols that were revolutionizing pediatric care across 43 children's hospitals in 12 countries. My white coat bore the embroidered logo of the Morrison Castellano Foundation for Pediatric Medical Ethics, and the weight of responsibility it represented no longer intimidated me. At 18, I had testified before Congress, consulted with the World Health Organization, and established diagnostic protocols that had identified over 200 cases of previously missed rare diseases in children. Medical fraud in pediatric care represents more than financial crime, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the packed auditorium. It represents a fundamental betrayal of the trust that families place in us when their children are most vulnerable. In the front row, Frank Castellano sat with Isabella and Finley, who was now 9 years old and completely healthy. Frank's presence at medical conferences had initially raised eyebrows among academics who knew his reputation, but his foundation's impact on pediatric care had earned grudging respect from even the most skeptical physicians. Dr. Martinez sat beside them, now serving as Dean of Pediatric Medicine at Johns Hopkins after implementing reforms that had become the gold standard for medical institutions worldwide. His pride in my presentation was evident in his beaming smile and enthusiastic note-taking. The Morrison Protocol, I continued, requires 3 independent diagnostic reviews for any pediatric case involving extended hospitalization or unusual treatment regimens. This simple safeguard has reduced diagnostic errors by 67% and eliminated billing irregularities in participating hospitals. Agent Chen, now promoted to head the Healthcare Fraud Division, raised her hand from the audience. Ms. Morrison, what's been the most significant challenge in implementing these protocols? Resistance from physicians who view oversight as questioning their expertise, I replied honestly. Medical training emphasizes individual authority and decision-making. Creating systems of accountability requires cultural change, not just procedural modification. Frank's slight smile told me he appreciated the diplomatic way I'd phrased that answer. Over the past 2 years, he'd taught me the value of strategic communication, how to present uncomfortable truths in ways that encouraged cooperation rather than defensiveness. However, I continued, we've found that when physicians understand the protocols are designed to support rather than undermine their clinical judgment, adoption rates improve dramatically. The goal isn't to second-guess medical decisions, but to identify patterns that might indicate systemic problems. Professor Sarah Williams from Harvard Medical School stood. Miss Morrison, your diagnostic accuracy rate for rare diseases is unprecedented. How do you account for this success? The question went to the heart of everything I'd learned about medicine and life. Pattern recognition, I said. Most rare diseases present with combinations of common symptoms. When you approach each case without preconceptions about what the diagnosis should be, you're more likely to see what's actually there rather than what you expect to see. Finley raised his hand from the front row, drawing chuckles from the audience. Miss Faith, will you tell them about the time you found the brain tumor that 14 doctors missed? Finley, Isabella gently chided, but I nodded at her with a smile. Young Mr. Castellano is referring to a case from last month, I said. 8-year-old patient presenting with behavioral changes, academic decline, and intermittent headaches. Psychiatric evaluation, neurological examination, and standard imaging all suggested attention deficit disorder with possible anxiety. I clicked to the next slide, showing brain scans that had been read as normal by multiple radiologists. The key was in the temporal pattern of symptoms, I explained. The headaches occurred specifically during periods of rapid atmospheric pressure change, weather fronts, altitude changes, air travel. This suggested intracranial pressure variation, which led us to request specialized imaging that revealed a small but growing tumor in the posterior fossa. Early surgical intervention was completely successful, Dr. Martinez added. The child is expected to make a full recovery with no lasting effects. Frank's expression during this presentation was one I'd grown to recognize, pride mixed with something deeper, more protective. Over time, he'd evolved from patron to something approaching a father figure, though neither of us had explicitly acknowledged that relationship. After the presentation, we gathered in Dr. Martinez's office for what had become our traditional post-conference debriefing. The space was warm and familiar, lined with medical texts and family photos that included several pictures of Foundation events where Finley and I were receiving various awards. 18 acceptances, Dr. Martinez announced, consulting his tablet. 18 medical schools want to implement the Morrison Protocol as part of their standard curriculum. That's wonderful, Isabella said, her accent softening the words with genuine warmth. Faith, you're changing the entire profession. I settled into the comfortable chair that had become mine during these meetings, still slightly amazed that my opinions were sought and valued by people whose expertise I'd once admired from afar. We're changing it, I corrected. None of this would be possible without the Foundation's resources and support. Frank's smile was small but genuine. Resources are tools, Faith. Vision and determination are what create change. You've always had both. Speaking of change, Dr. Martinez said, I have news about Dr. Walsh. The room went quiet. Dr. Walsh had been a shadowy presence hanging over our work for 2 years. Arrested, tried, convicted, and imprisoned for medical fraud and racketeering. His trial had generated headlines about corruption in pediatric medicine and led to federal legislation requiring stricter oversight of children's hospitals. He died in federal prison last week, Dr. Martinez said quietly. Heart attack. The other inmates had apparently learned about his crimes against children. Frank's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense of completed justice. His victims can find closure now. I thought about the 47 children whose cases had been reviewed during the investigation, the families who had suffered unnecessarily because of Dr. Walsh's greed. Justice was a complicated concept when children's lives were involved. There's something else, Frank said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Faith, the Foundation Board has made a decision about your future role. He handed me an elegant folder embossed with the Foundation logo. Inside was a formal document that made my heart skip several beats. Chief Medical Officer? I read aloud. Mr. Castellano, I'm still an undergraduate student. I won't even start medical school for 2 more years. You'll be CMO designate until you complete your training, Frank explained. But the board believes you've already demonstrated the leadership and vision needed to guide our medical programs. Isabella leaned forward. Frank and I want to expand the Foundation's mission. Beyond fraud prevention, beyond protocol development. We want to create a new model of pediatric care that prioritizes healing over profit in every aspect. Medical schools that train physicians to see patients as people, rather than revenue sources, Dr. Martinez added. Hospitals that measure success by healing rates rather than billing optimization. Research programs that focus on rare diseases affecting children instead of conditions that generate pharmaceutical profits. The scope of what they were proposing was breathtaking. You're talking about reshaping the entire medical establishment. We're talking about finishing what you started, Frank said simply. When you identified the patterns that led to Dr. Walsh's exposure, you proved that the current system is fundamentally broken. Now we have the opportunity to build something better. Through the office window, I could see the Baltimore skyline, a city where some of the world's most advanced medical research was conducted in institutions that sometimes lost sight of their fundamental mission, healing the sick and protecting the vulnerable. I accept, I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was agreeing to undertake. But I have conditions. Frank's eyebrow arched slightly. Such as complete transparency in all foundation operations, public reporting of every grant, every program outcome, every failure and success. If we're going to demand accountability from others, we have to hold ourselves to the same standard. Agreed, Isabella said immediately. Equal representation on the board, I continued. Not just wealthy donors and medical administrators, but parents of patients, community health workers, people who understand healthcare from the perspective of those who need it most. Frank nodded approvingly. You've learned to think strategically. I've learned from the best, I replied, meeting his storm-gray eyes. One more condition. Finley gets to be our first teenage advisory board member when he's old enough. He understands what it's like to be a patient better than any of us. Finley, who had been quietly drawing in his notebook during the adult conversation, looked up with bright eyes. Really? I can help make sure other kids don't get scared in hospitals? Really, I promised. We need someone who remembers what it feels like to be small and sick and worried. As we left Dr. Martinez's office, Frank fell into step beside me. The corridors of Johns Hopkins buzzed with the controlled chaos of academic medicine. Students rushing to classes, residents discussing cases, researchers collaborating on projects that might change the world. Faith, Frank said quietly. Do you ever regret how your life changed? The path that brought you here? I considered the question seriously. 2 years ago, I'd been an invisible teenager cleaning floors and stealing moments to read medical journals. Now I was heading an organization that influenced pediatric care policy worldwide, with resources to implement changes I'd only dreamed about. No, I said honestly. Everything that happened, meeting your family, exposing Dr. Walsh, building the foundation, it all led to work that matters. Children are healthier because of what we've accomplished. And personally? Frank's voice carried a note of concern I'd learned to recognize. You've sacrificed a normal teenage experience, college social life, dating, the freedom to make mistakes without consequences. I laughed softly. Mr. Castellano, I was never going to have a normal teenage experience. Brilliant black girls from poor families don't get to be normal. We get to be extraordinary, or we get to be invisible. Frank was quiet for a moment, processing that observation. And you chose extraordinary. I chose to matter, I corrected, to make a difference that would outlast my lifetime. We'd reached the parking garage where Stefano waited beside the Castellano family's car. Finley was already inside, chattering excitedly to his mother about his future role as teenage medical advisor. Faith, Frank said, extending his hand for what had become our traditional farewell handshake. Thank you. For my son's life, for your dedication to this work, for becoming part of our family. I shook his hand, feeling the strength and warmth that had protected and supported me through 2 years of unprecedented change. Thank you for seeing potential instead of just a cleaning girl with impossible dreams. As their car pulled away, I walked to my own vehicle, a practical sedan that the foundation provided for my work-related travel. My phone buzzed with messages from colleagues around the world, implementation updates from hospitals in Germany, diagnostic questions from pediatricians in Australia, invitation to speak at a rare disease conference in Tokyo. But the message that made me smile came from my mother. Saw you on the medical news tonight. Dad would be so proud. I love you, baby girl. Dad, the father I'd never known, who'd died when I was 2, but who'd apparently passed on the stubborn determination that drove me to question everything and fight for what was right. Maybe he would be proud of the woman I was becoming. As I drove through Baltimore toward my apartment near campus, I thought about the children who would benefit from protocols I'd develop, hospitals I'd help reform, physicians I'd train to see their patients as whole human beings deserving of compassion and excellent care. The road ahead stretched into darkness, but I knew exactly where I was going. To medical school, to groundbreaking research, to a lifetime of work that would matter long after I was gone. I was Faith Morrison, Chief Medical Officer Designate of the Morrison Castellano Foundation, future pediatric physician, and guardian of children who deserved better than the system that had nearly failed Finley Castellano. And I was just getting started.